Friday to you all, to our faculty and grad students, but also we have a number of guests in the room, and it's really wonderful to see you all. So, selfishly, this is really exciting for me. I know that it is very exciting to you also, but today we're featuring somebody that I considered to be a huge mentor, if you will, in the field of social influence and interpersonal communication, Dr. Michael Roloff. And yeah, in fact, when I went to the doctoral honors seminar years and years ago, 1997 or 8, something like that, he indeed was my mentor there along with Brent Burleson. And it was just wonderful to be able to work with you. But you've influenced so many of our careers. But what is also fantastic is we have a member from my cohort, Kenzie Cameron, who has graciously coordinated this. Frank Boster, member of our faculty, my own advisor. And of course, Jim Dillard and Denise Solomon, who are legends in the world of social influence and interpersonal communication. So I feel like we have quite the cast of characters here. It's pretty amazing. In fact, I'm throwing jewelry around. All right.
Wow.
So, really pleased to have you all here. So honored to have all of you here. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Kenzie to open up our panel. All right. Welcome, Kenzie.
All right. Thank you so much, Mo. And thank you all for being here. I'll just add my thanks to that. It is so great to see so many faces, so many smiling faces, faces I recognize and haven't seen for a number of years. So I'm Kenzie Cameron. I graduated with my PhD from here in 1998. And I'm going to give just a quick intro both to the panel and to the speakers, and I'll turn it over to them. And I'm looking at Frank's face and my husband's face to see if they believe me it will be quick, but I'm going to do my best. But I just want to start by saying that, so I just came in from being in Madison, Wisconsin the last 2 days at a mentoring conference. And they started a panel yesterday morning, and they said each of these speakers was selected for a particular reason. Well, each of these speakers that you'll see today, including Esther Liu, who is going to be here, but we have her via video because she was unable to attend, so she pre-recorded something, were self-selected to be here. Because all of us have grown, have learned from Mike, and we wanted to be able to do something to honor him. He retired from Northwestern after 42 years on the faculty this past fall. He was a 1974 master's graduate from Michigan State, a 1975 PhD graduate from Michigan State, did everything in 3 years, just FYI. And at Northwestern, he has, I like this statistic just because for those of us having been students and then faculty, you know what this means. During the time he was at Northwestern, he served on 164 master's and PhD committees, of which he was the primary advisor to 53 master's students and 44 PhD students. So when we say, at least as long as my statistics skills are still with me and I could count, because I counted that on his CV. I know, not really statistics, but we know just, what that means, how much time and effort that means he has put into not only the field, his research, his work, but the work of so many who then came after him. So just really briefly, Mo has already noted the panelists up here. I'm just going to throw out a few additional aspects because it is kind of this alumni weekend. I hope you all know that Mike is receiving the Outstanding Alumni Award tomorrow night from the College of Arts and Sciences. But so as we know, we have Frank, who is a 1977 graduate of Michigan State. Jim, who is, I wrote it here somewhere, 1983 graduate of Michigan State, and I asked the speakers if there was anything particular they wanted me to mention during the introduction of them, and he mentioned that he wanted Mike to make sure that he knew that Jim has been a fan of your research since 1953, just so you know. And then in addition to the Michigan State connection, we have a Northwestern connection, which is where I first met Mike. Mike was my undergraduate advisor. And when I was there, the graduate student who was there was Denise Solomon. So she graduated from Northwestern with her PhD in 1992. And then Esther Liu, who you'll see on the big screen, graduated with her PhD in 2016. And so the people that are up here, as I mentioned, many of us are here because of Mike and with Mike's help. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Frank. If any of you would like to add to your introductions, please feel free. I didn't actually say much other than where your degrees were from, but please feel free, but I'll turn it to you. No, you can sit and use this one, unless you want to.
Is this, okay, that's fine. Okay, so I'm going to talk about embers, and you remember embers. Yeah. The vast majority of research and communication when I started and when Mike started and before that, well before that, was on message effects. And so people looked at the effect of fear appeals, if there were persuasion people, and they looked at the effect of counter-attitudinal advocacy, and mass media people studied the effect of film and television on violence, violence on TV and violent behavior and things like that. Network people studied things, or organizational people studied effects of networks and information flow in networks and so on. But when we got here, for at least a relatively short time, we refocused things, and that's what Embers was. It was a refocus. Because instead of focusing on message effects, we focused on message production or generation or selection, however you want to characterize that. The factors that predicted that. There were a number of people here who pursued such lines of research, a number of people around the country who did, but we were among them, and I think probably the first to do so. Our work was also incredibly influential for what Mike and I did. We received a Wilbert Award. That's given for scholarship of exceptional originality and influence. And it was often imitated, that work was, but never duplicated. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. It was published in Monographs in '77, and it was titled Compliance Gaining Message Strategies, Topology, and Some Findings Concerning Situational Differences. The authors were Miller, Boster, Roloff, and Siebel. Given the first letter of our last names, that's MBRS, it became known as Embers. Jack Hunter gave it that. For those of you who might have known Jack, gave us that name. So to preface my comments addressing how the project came about and how it was executed to the best of my admittedly faulty memory, I want to make some comments about the academic milieu in which those embers were ignited. Miller, the late great Gerald Miller, had been here since Dirt by the time I got here. Dirt started in '62. Mike got here in '72 without his master's. Dave Siebel and I got here in '73 with our master's. The faculty had brought in 33 students in '73. That was a mistake. It happened because Miller was director of graduate studies halfway through the year, and then Greenberg took over. They both brought in their own class. So brought in 33, and 12 finished. It was hell. And I'm told that when you came, there were about 30 some odd as well. There were also a lot, about maybe 10 of you finished, something like that, 10, 12. So there's a lot of attrition. But there was some incredible grad school talent when I was here. I learned as much or more from my peers than I did from the faculty. There was Joe Capella, Bob Craig, Byron Reeves, Mike Reeves to us, George Barnett, Mac Parks, Dave Sewell. You recognize all those names if you look at the ICA Fellows list. They were all fellows. Even in such a stellar group, however, Mike stood out for a number of reasons. First thing, as Kinsey said, he finished in 3 years, but notice he came in sans masters. That means in 3 years, he wrote a master's thesis. Not one, because we had to write 2 comprehensive papers, and his dissertation. Okay? Did those 4 things, and he did them in 3 years. In his spare time, he published several papers, because after all, we had to get jobs, so we have to do that, had to do that too. He taught not only at MSU, but as I recall, you taught at Columbia College. Which was that was a great gig. I did that too. That was sweet. Made a lot of money off that puppy. Columbia College, he taught Army recruiters.
I did.
And that was a treat. He worked for the two most demanding professors in the department, Miller and Greenberg. And they were demanding, and they were part of a faculty that was incredibly demanding as well, including people like Chuck Atkin, Herb Benninghouse, Don Cushman, and with whom we suffered many humiliating evenings at his house, and Ed Fink, Joe Wolfel, among others. And he also had the best beard of any of us. Impressive. Also, during his last year, I know that somebody stole his Sheltie, Duffy, by far the greatest dog ever, wonderful animal. Stole him. Mike was really upset about that. He landed a position in Kentucky, and he also got married during. So that all happened in 3 years. I remember him always looking tired. I'd get off the elevator on the 5th floor. Kids, he'd come trundling down the hall, and there was Mike, looking tired. And it wasn't helped by the fact that he had this office mate, whose name will not mention that person because he's a well-known figure in the field, who would, as he said, because I ended up sharing an apartment with him later, he would get a call from Dr. Valdez, which would mean the drugs were in. And so occasionally you walk by Mike's office and there's Mike looking tired and this other guy bouncing off the wall. And Mike, head into the book though, not losing the end. He powers of concentration far beyond that of mortal men. It was incredible. So, but after a short time, he took a job in Kentucky. After a short time in Kentucky, he moved to Northwestern, and subsequent speakers will address that. Embers happened this way. Several of us took a seminar in the spring quarter of '74, and we were on the quarter system. From Ed Fink about interpersonal tactics, and we read Marwell and Schmidt. And so when Mike and Dave and I took a seminar with Miller in the summer of '74, Miller had just published his interpersonal book, great interpersonal book, called Between People. And Miller said, well, one of the legitimate criticisms of my book, when it's reviewed, is that there's not a lot of research addressing some of the issues I've addressed. So he said, what we'd like to do in the seminar is do that. And so Mike and Dave and I, having experience with that paper, decided that we would try to vary the situational differences, parameters in that set of scenarios. Now that particular paper introduced the compliance gaining message task. They had developed a topology of 16 tactics, created 4 scenarios in which one person attempted to gain the compliance of another, and asked their subjects how likely they'd be to use each tactic in each of those situations. We each wrote one of the 4 scenarios. They say a lot about us, don't they? More than what was going on in our lives at the time. So we won't go there. That's not a good place. So anyway, we as a graduate student, I was involved in a lot of studies, and I've been involved in a lot of research since then, with fellow graduate students, with faculty, and with one third grader actually. But Embers was the most fun project in which I've ever engaged, without a doubt. It was because I was working with really smart people who worked really hard. and it was a fun and new and exciting idea at the time. And Mike was, as I recall, Mike was instrumental in getting us a relatively diverse and large sample. He tapped those Army recruiters who became part of our subject pool. I don't know how you got the community college people. I didn't go there, but somehow you did that, as well as some MSU students. Miller wrote the introduction. Mike wrote the method sections, I recall. I wrote the results, and Dave did the discussion. Miller liked the paper a lot, so he commanded us that he would be the first author. We didn't argue, and the rest of us just went alphabetically. That's the way it came down. It wasn't the first paper on our Vita, and certainly wasn't the last, but it was a relatively big hit for Mike, Dave, and me. And Common Monographs at the time was probably the most prestigious, if not the second most prestigious journal in our field. The paper won awards, stimulated a lot of research. Mike went on from there to several more important contributions in the areas of compliance gating, then moved on to other things, including some excellent but underappreciated papers with Barnicott. I thought were really great. Then he found inspiration in other issues, and we'll now hear from some of those fortunate enough to have worked with him on those projects.
I'm just distracted now by realizing that if the authors had been in the order in which they contributed to the manuscript, it would have been Mr. BS. So I may not be able to actually listen to Jim.
You ever actually listened to Jim?
This time I have a public excuse.
I got the sense I'm starting in a hole. Well, yes, thank you. Thank you so very much. It is a pleasure to be here amongst you, Michigan Staters. Also, of course, the motivation for our meeting, Michael Elwood Roloff. Always a pleasure to be in his company. I'd like to make a couple of comments about his work on interpersonal influence, Roloff's influence on interpersonal influence. And to do that, I'd like to kind of pick up where Frank left off historically, and sort of locate this, the work on interpersonal influence, the obstacle hypothesis, give you a little bit of history. Some of you, maybe as many as a third of you, this will be old hat, you lived it. But for the rest of you, maybe this will be something new. Following the impact of the Embers paper, which was a fine piece of research, and one that really did have a tremendous impact on the field. If you want to study interpersonal influence, there were kind of two strands of work. One of them we could call the three-card Monty theme. It involved things like the foot in the door and the door in the face procedures, these little linguistic request sequences in which the source was always someone who was going to gain the compliance of the target, and the target was in some sense always a dupe. Someone who we're gonna move these cards around, and this room is going to be taken to the cleaners, and then we're going to go down the street and do it again. I was involved in some of that. I take responsibility for that, and I've been through a program and okay. The other alternative was the sort of message production theme, which in retro, despite all the powerful impact that had, from the 20 or 30 years later, you can see how it might look a little different. And one of the ways you could look at that message selection or search is sort of through the lens of an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. Some of you have seen Terminator 1, probably, where the Arnold character, the Terminator, he's been shot up for a while, and he's hiding out in this grubby little apartment, and one of his eyes is sort of biological, the other's kind of ripped away here, and you can see the red light glowing, and he's starting to smell. because he's been in there for several days. And the landlord comes and bangs on the door, and this menu of message options comes up. Bing, 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 and you can see him review each one until he chooses the one that he utters. And because this is a family program, I can't say what that option is, you'll have to go back. But that was the sort of the two options you had if you wanted to study interpersonal influence. These themes, the balls that were rolling in the field. So into this situation strolls Dr. Roloff with the obstacle hypothesis. The idea that requesters strategically construct messages to address the most likely reasons that targets might offer to refuse the request. So think ahead, plan a little bit. This was a big move, although it might not sound like it initially, because this embraced a conception of the audience, the target, from the perspective of the theory of mind. You know, when kids are little, they know what they want. They say, "Give me a cookie, mother, God damn it." Yeah, mothers, you've been there.
Might just be our kids.
And when they get this big, they're supposed to have developed a theory of mind. That is, the idea that the person they're trying to get the cookie from might have their own wants and needs, their own mind, their own conception of reality, and that the way to get the cookie would be to take into account those features of their minds, those of the moment, those of the characteristics, and so forth. So they might say, you know, "Mother, could I have a cookie, please? And if you give me one, I'll do my homework." Something that speaks to the needs and desires of the target. So that's a pretty big difference to move from identifying these sets of variables that might predict message selection or might govern the use of these three-card Monty techniques. It was a meta-theoretical move, and it recognized that strategic communication occurred not only in a single individual, not just in the source, but in both the source and the target. Both of those were not necessarily best conceived of as source and target, but rather as interlocutors of equal weight and consequence, both with their own interests. So Mike did a whole series of papers in collaboration with his students on this obstacle hypothesis. Beautiful series of papers. They're precise, they're conceptually elegant, they're well executed, they're thoughtful. I remember receiving such a paper when I had graduated and I'd done some reviews for journals, and I just thought, why are these papers so bad? And then I got this paper that was just beautiful, and it was on the obstacle hypothesis, and there was nothing to say except publish this puppy. It's beautiful. So that was my first exposure to it, and it was a really positive exposure. But it was not nearly all that Mike did on this line of research. He identified different types of obstacles. Sometimes people can't do things or don't want to do things because they're not able to. Sometimes timing's not good, you know, maybe later. Harry invites me over to dinner. He says, "Hey, me and Megan, we'd like to have you over for dinner." I have to say, "Well, not Saturday, but maybe some other day." Sometimes it's an imposition, you know, "You don't bother me. You get your own cookies, kid, you know, leave me alone." Sometimes you just don't want to do it. So Mike did an elegant set of studies identifying all these different types of obstacles and the principles that govern them, when they were most likely to appear, the types of request sequences that might co-occur with different obstacles. And so it was nice to turn that obstacle hypothesis, the lens of that, onto a request that was made. I mean, well, just hypothetically, suppose that someone, Katrina maybe, or Denise, or someone, wanted to ask someone else, Michael Elwood Roloff, to attend a celebration honoring his retirement and his scholarship. I mean, it could happen, right? We were big in hypothetical scenarios back then, but it could happen. And you know what the answer was? It was no, yet, nine, nuka, absolutely not, ain't doing it, forget it, and no thank you. He seemed to be exhibiting some resistance. And this, of course, is endemic to the research that he did. One of the things we learned from the obstacle research is that they're not always expressed by the target. The obstacles themselves, you might see resistance, but the reasons for that resistance are not always expressed by the target. And in fact, Mike just said he wasn't gonna do it. No, okay? He didn't apparently want this to happen. That's a particularly, that's an important insight to recognize that about the communication situation, but it also reveals something about the source and the actor, the interlocutors, is that although we think about interpersonal influence as being sort of a goal-driven activity, it's possible that the interlocutors might not fully apprehend their own goals. And in fact, that was obviously the case in this instance. He wanted to do it, he just didn't know he wanted to do it. So, fortunately, there was a map how to solve this problem. We knew from the obstacles research that if the obstacle was imposition, Mike's research said, specify the limits of request. For example, it might say, don't worry, it's going to be a small, intimate gathering, just 4 or 5 people around a table, having a beer. Ability, well, we could always arrange transportation. We could even make the highways damaged so you wouldn't be worried about having to drive too fast when you came here. There wouldn't be any tickets involved. What else have you got to do? Sort of deal with the timing obstacle. And, if you were to come to such a thing, hypothetically, people would just put a whole bunch of love on you. Buckets of it, So trying to look at that map the obstacles research showed us. Members of his network, his social network, went to work immediately. They were intimately familiar with this obstacles research, so they began to apply it. Dr. Boster submitted a nomination for an alumni award, and which succeeded, of course. So now it's not an imposition that Dr. Roloff can refuse, it's an obligation. What about the timing? Well, hell, how about April 14th? Wouldn't that be a great day? You could see your friends, your family, your old students, your colleagues. They'd put buckets of love on you, and here we are. And thank you for doing that research, Dr. Roloff. So, I could go on at length about Mike's contributions to interpersonal influence research. They are numerous, they are varied, they are thoughtful, they are theoretical, they're precise, they're elegant, they're important. These are beautiful products of a deeply paranoid mind. I'm delighted to be able to be here today to share my thoughts with you about them and to honor Dr. Roloff.
Oh, Mike. Here we go again. The first time I was invited to roast and celebrate the accomplishments of Mike Roloff was sometime in the 1990s when he received an honor for his outstanding teaching from the Central States Speech Communication Association in Milwaukee. I was an assistant professor at the time and uncertain about my academic future, as all assistant professors are, so I played it straight. Fortunately, the other members of the panel taught me how this is supposed to be done. But it was also a pleasure to speak on that panel because Mike is truly an excellent teacher. And I don't know if we will spend as much time on that topic, and it just deserves to be underscored. His undergraduate classes at Northwestern are standing room only classes, especially his class on conflict and conflict management. Everyone knew that class was amazing. Kenzie's taken it. Really in large measure because his family provided so much food for thought and colorful examples for the class. So you may have discerned that one of Mike's daughters, Katrina LeBlanc, is here. I will say that she does not figure as prominently in most of the stories about conflict. She figures very prominently in stories about vomiting on car trips.
Thank you, Denise.
And I just wanted to underscore that because she did drive all the way from Chicago today, and her entire family took considerable risks to ensure that she could be here today. If you look at his CV, you'll see another facet of his teaching that Kenzie has alluded to, and that is the incredible generosity that Mike has given to the graduate students that have worked with him over the years. It sounds like the link to the podcast that NCA created is floating around now, and as Mike, I was my pleasure to interview Mike for that podcast, and as he was describing his research, he really talks about, disclosed and correctly identified how he really lets students kind of do whatever crazy thing we had on our minds, and then he figured out how to make those look like good theoretical sound research ideas. But it was an amazing way and place to get a PhD, and I saw him do it over and over and over again with different students, where he allowed us to develop our passions and take our research where it went and give us lots of, usually, I was a student before email, so my feedback went like this. The phone rang, and I picked it up, and he said, so here's what we've got to do. And an hour later, I'm scribbling as fast as I can, my thesis was rewritten yet once again. But he is detailed and thorough and always has been, and kind and supportive to all of his students. I should also say though, that if you haven't heard this advice from him, take it into your careers. Mike never gives advice on how to live our lives because he doesn't want us to blame him for it when it goes badly. So subsequent to that panel in Milwaukee, there were several calls to honor Mike, including one, I believe it was the Wilbert panel celebration, where I mapped his career onto the Rolling Stones song list, and another when he received the Nat Distinguished Interpersonal Communication Award, where I framed it as a eulogy. Mike is still kicking, thank goodness. I'm running out of material. And I would love to just rehash one of those presentations, but I don't know if you are aware that Mike has an encyclopedic memory. It is actually a reason for delight in publishing with him and collaborating with him, because he knows all of the literature. It is agonizing to co-author with him because he knows all of the literature. Denise, you're really going to have to elaborate that section because there's a whole bunch of studies done in the 1970s in social psychology on monkeys, and you haven't really captured that. Okay, I'll do my best. But it does mean that if I were to borrow any of that material from the past, he would notice in an instant, and also on his CV is a paper he did on the problems of self-plagiarism. So, in search of invention, and as a means of assimilating and capturing all of his extensive contribution to the study of interpersonal conflict, I conducted a sophisticated analysis using the titles of Mike's articles written on conflict. I made a word cloud. Everything from 1974 to present, just the titles, otherwise the word journal would be showing up in really big print too. Just the titles of the articles that he's done that were on issues related to conflict. So let's sit with this word cloud and really understand what the data are telling us. Notice the words closest to Roloff's name. Conflict, all right, that's what these papers were on. Communication, consequences. Mike believes that communication has consequences. Always, usually bad ones. Communication, consequences, relationships, interpersonal, hurtful, hurt, confrontation. There's no happiness when you put communication and consequences together. So this body of work sorts itself into two streams, really. Not surprisingly, given that communication has consequences, Mike has done a considerable amount of research helping us appreciate the value and nuances of conflict avoidance. I remember some of the work we did when journal reviewers would tell us, well, this is not communication, you're studying avoidance. It's sort of kind of relevant though, don't you think? So it chipped away until the world understood that avoidance was a real and viable alternative and option, and he would argue way better than communication when it comes to it. So you see that he did work that really moved forward and made more sophisticated our understanding of taboo topics, when couples declare topics as taboo. Actually, I think you have a study that shows that having taboo topics is fine. Mutually acknowledging that you have taboo topics is bad, because we like to believe that we can talk about anything. And that's really good as long as we don't. Right? Don't say yes, we can never talk about that again. Just don't talk about it. Right? He did work on mulling and rumination, which still has driven work on imagined interactions and conflict linkage theory, and work on the chilling effect as a way of appreciating that power does in fact corrupt. Now, of course, avoidance has its downsides, and as I perused these different titles, I was happy to see words reflecting in phrases that he's brought to our study of avoidance, such as exhausting silence, regretted withholding, emotion overflow, the silent treatment, resentment thresholds. With Roloff, it isn't so much that you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You're just damned. So let's go back to this Wordle for a moment. Another prominent word down here on the bottom right is serial, and you get argument and arguments. And in work since I left, after I left Northwestern and with other students, Mike really rejuvenated the study of serial arguments in the communication discipline. I should really say that he helped us understand the downsides and the further downsides of recurrent, repetitive, futile, unresolvable, why don't you just leave me alone conflicts. He studied these fulfilling romantic experiences in the context of parent-child relationships, adult-child and older parent relationships. If you see a trend following the course of life, he's probably going to have one on advisors and former beloved mentees. Wherever we might expect love to flourish, Mike finds hostility, stress, demand withdrawal cycles, and maladaptive sequences. So you might think from this characterization of Mike that I think he's kind of a Debbie Downer, Eeyore kind of person. And I know that some of you have thought that maybe before. He's a little bit negative. But I believe that Roloff is proof that not every darkness has a light side. And yet, I am a steadfast believer that Mike is an optimist. And I've said this before. I'm now doing a little self-plagiarizing. With Mike, it's not whether the glass is half full or half empty. For as long as I've known him, the glass is cracked and bone dry. And now the doctor says, don't drink beer. And yet, can you imagine seeing the world in such bleak, stark terms, and yet continuing to do so much to make it better? In Mike's service, he just seeks out places that are little pockets of happiness. He's had long-term service on the Institutional Review Board at Northwestern University. And we all know that he served in the trenches as editor at Communication Research for far longer than most people could have survived. He also really cannot repress the spark. Little children approach him, I've seen it, because they think he's Santa Claus. They run up to him on airplanes and they think he's Santa Claus. You just can't hide the twinkle that is fundamentally the heartbeat of this man. In the words of the Rolling Stones, because we must always return there, I think he hides behind the veneer of painted black. And he may well have sympathy for the devil. But while he professes that he can't get no satisfaction, he never fails to deliver what we need. I'm very grateful to Monique and Kenzie and Frank for making this all come together. I'm grateful for Katrina for asking me 4 months before he retired. Aren't y'all doing something? I'm really grateful for Mike agreeing to come and join us.
We're going to drive him anyway.
And I just want to thank you for everything you've done for me and for all of us in the field. Thanks.
And we did promise Mike a chance at the mic, but we have one more fairly brief speaker, Esther Liu, who is unable to be here today. But before I pop her up on the screen, I want to just add one comment to Denise's, which is the way that I have always described Mike, and I'm not sure you know this, is that there's always a rain cloud over his head, but he's holding the umbrella over yours.
Aww.
So I will now let you hear what Esther has to say.
Greetings from DC, and a special thank you to Dr. Cameron for putting together today's panel. If we were to conduct a survey of undergraduate students across the years who have taken a class with Dr. Roloff, asking them, how would you describe Dr. Roloff? We'd likely see descriptions of his humorous and purposeful storytelling, his ability to teach without relying on any notes or presentation slides, or perhaps his resemblance to Robin Williams. In the next few minutes, I'd like to describe my experience of Dr. Roloff through some examples of his research on serial arguments. What do I mean by serial arguments? Roloff and Johnson described these as argumentative episodes focused on the same issue that occur at least twice. Dr. Roloff's serial argument research showed me that 1 + 1 can sometimes equal 3, namely that the impact of serial arguments on relational quality is more complex than the number of times an argument has occurred. For example, a serial argument that has occurred 2 times could have as big of an impact on the relationship as another serial argument that has occurred 20 times. How so? because the impact of serial arguments varies more by how confident someone feels about the progress they're making toward resolution. Dr. Roloff's research also showed me that 1 + 1 can equal 3 through his unique way of drawing from multiple perspectives. He takes in the perspectives of his peers in communication, scholarly voices in other fields, and practitioner insights, and asks unique questions that further enrich those perspectives. In 2006, Roloff and Resnick focused on a specific destructive conflict behavior of mutual hostility, and found that as mutual hostility in conflict increases, the impact of constructive communication on stress becomes weaker. Now, why was that finding important? Their study offered a distinct perspective from Gottman's 5-to-1 ratio that recommends aiming for 5 positive interactions for every negative interaction. Their findings emphasized the importance of reducing negative behaviors and suggested ways to do that, like proactively discussing issues instead of waiting until emotions have built up into a harsh confrontation. When I began working on several research projects with Dr. Roloff, I experienced this 1 + 1 = 3 phenomenon for myself. One graduate student working with Dr. Roloff is more than 2 brains working together. His brain generates novel and insightful ideas at superhuman speeds. And if it's related at all to his coffee consumption, I'll have what he's having. I experienced this when we were working together on research about the emotional costs of withholding complaints. Those of us who don't withhold complaints might view it as a passive inaction. But others of us who withhold know that it often involves a lot of internal activity, like ruminating, thinking repetitively about a partner's upsetting behavior. We found that rumination can prompt passive-aggressive responses like the silent treatment, essentially ignoring one's partner. And silent treatment can be costly for the person who uses it, as it predicts higher levels of emotional exhaustion. We also looked at cognitive reappraisal, taking on a different perspective about a partner's behavior. And we thought that it would help reduce the emotional costs of passive-aggressive behaviors. And just when I thought we were wrapping up the analyses, Dr. Roloff shared an idea for an exploratory analysis along these lines. Constructive strategies in conflict often take time and practice to learn to do well. So could it also be the case that cognitive reappraisal takes time and practice to learn? Maybe over time, individuals can learn to develop a less negative understanding of their partner's behaviors. And we found some support for this idea. For individuals who use cognitive reappraisal, those who have been withholding for shorter periods report higher levels of silent treatment than those who have been withholding for longer times. This was an encouraging reminder to me to not be too short-sighted in conflict. Instead, we might think of constructive strategies in conflict as longer-term investments in relational quality and our own health. Today, I've described a few stories of how Dr. Roloff's research on serial arguments has taught me that 1 + 1 can equal 3. I'd like to wrap up with a few last words to Dr. Roloff. Mike, thank you so much for your generous spirit and support throughout all these years to so many of us in advising us in the ups and downs, twists and turns of grad school, from the changes in the research pool to unexpected life events. And thank you especially for taking me on as your advisee in 2010, continuing to be a mentor to me today.
We did promise Mike a chance for rebuttal. Maybe we shouldn't have, but I do not go back on my promises, so I will now turn it over to Mike. And just before I do want to note that Mike is incredibly humble. And so the fact that he has sat up here hearing all these wonderful accolades, which are all true, for the last 45 minutes is challenging for him. But we knew he might not love it, but it was very important to us that we had the opportunity from so many colleagues and friends to say thanks. Now I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I've got to fill in some insights too. I mean, come on. You're right, I was initially not sold on this idea at all. And there were a whole bunch of obstacles, some of which you didn't mention. I mean, it is true that I've tried to build a career by working and not promoting. I've flown below the radar as much as I possibly could, largely because I discovered people who fly in the radar get shot down. So I figured, just go underneath. They can't hit you with a missile when you're that low to the ground. And so, I got used to that. And this sort of was a little bit uncomfortable. Fortunately, you're not monitoring my heart rate, blood pressure, and all those things, or my cardiologist would be getting in touch with you as we're doing all of this stuff. And, there's an old notion that says that right before you pass, your life moves right before your eyes. And so I was going to call my cardiologist to see if anyone had hacked into my medical records, and thought perhaps that some of you might know something I don't know yet, and that you're just sort of pushing this along or fulfilling your obligation to say it to me before I'm in an urn or under the ground or being composted, whatever it is that they choose to do with what my remains might be at that particular time. So that was a little bit bad. And then I looked around and I saw who was on the panel. And I said, these are all friends. It can't be that bad. It can't be that bad. And then I remember a quotation that was attributed to Bob Dylan that actually he ripped off from Oscar Wilde that says, a true friend is someone who will stab you in the front rather than the back. And so I suddenly said, this isn't good. This is not good. I mean, bad things can happen as a result of all of that. So I got very nervous as I started looking through it. But then, and I said to myself, and it won't matter because nobody's going to be here. And you all showed up, and friends showed up, and colleagues, all these people I appreciate, and people who don't know who the hell I am are going to walk away and go, what a schnook. I'm glad I didn't have to work with him because he has such a dour outlook. It's got to be contagious. It's got to be contagious and will screw up my career. So anyway, out of obligation, finding out how hard people worked on this, but then I immediately thought, look, maybe this is just a huge prank, right? An incredibly effortful, well-constructed prank, and when I got the award, I kept thinking, they're having this dinner tonight. I know what's going to happen. We're going to have this. I'm going to show up at the dinner. No one's going to be there. There's just going to be a big sign saying, gotcha! And then I'm going to have to get in my car and drive back on 69 and on 94 and try to get back into Chicago without being too awfully angry. But anyway, so I got over that. So now back to the narrative that got left out. No one knew me as an undergraduate here, so I got to step back a little bit to give you some insights to how I ended up here and some of the behaviors they just described. I got my undergraduate degree at Indiana State, and I worked with a PhD from Michigan State, Sam Murley. And so it got close to my senior year, and I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do. I had been involved in debate. I could not imagine driving undergraduates or high school students around the Midwest in the winter to try to earn a living. And I'd taken his persuasion class and learned about all those things on message effects that you were talking about. And I thought, this is a neat idea. I'm going to do that. So I went to Sam and I said, Sam, maybe I want to go to graduate school. And he says, yeah. And being the true Michigan Stater, he said, there's only one place to go. And I sort of sat down and said, well, if it's that good, they probably don't want me. And so I thought, I don't know whether
Typical reaction.
So I thought maybe I don't want to apply there. And so I'd applied to a bunch of other places. And Jerry Miller came down because Jerry had worked with Sam. And so I met Jerry. And Jerry liked me. And he said, you're going to graduate school? I said, yeah. And he says, have you applied to Michigan State? I said, no. And he says, you need to apply to Michigan State. So this was about March. And it's getting a little late to get admitted. And in, I guess it was April, May, I got an admission letter saying I'd been accepted. I didn't know at the time there were 30 other people who got the same thing. But at least initially it was gratifying. You know? And so I thought, well, I ought to do this, and they're going to give me money. And so I hadn't even visited campus. So it was probably like June, and a bunch of my buddies got together, and I said, man, I'm going to Michigan State next year. And they said, what are you going to do there? And I said, well, I'm going to work on a graduate degree. And they said, where are you going to live? And I said, I don't know, East Lansing, I guess. So we jumped in the car and headed off to East Lansing and drove around here, managed to find a spot in a bad motel that doesn't exist anymore. Hit a couple of bars, didn't see any faculty at all. I mean, I contrast that with what we do to recruit graduate students now. And there I was, wandering through East Lansing, just trying to figure out, where in the hell's South Kedzie? You know, what is that? And trying to read the map and all the rest of it. So I did find the place, and I went back home, and it looked like I was going to do this. Now, my parents were on board with it, and so they'd help me fund some of it. I had an assistantship, they'd fill in the gaps. So I got ready to come up here, and I talked to Sam again. And I said, well, Sam, I'm going. I said, do you have any advice? And he says, yeah, I got a couple of pieces of advice. Number one, it's a highly politicized department. Stay out of the politics. Spend your time listening, but not talking. Notice the theme, not talking. He said, just sit there, get your work done. And he said, number two, the worst part is the first year. The first year is hell. They get rid of you, they cut you, they do all kinds of things. And I came here and found that was pretty true. You know, it was awful in those days. It was funny because some of the things they did would get us sued today. Fortunately, it's unfortunate that many of the people I'm going to describe are not here anymore. That's sad, but it's probably good from a litigation perspective. Because we arrived that first day, and they did the usual look to the left, look to the right, half of you will be gone next year. We had our first seminar, and the guy teaching it came in and listed all of our names in a list. It was not in alphabetical order, and he put our grades next to each one so we could all see what our grades were. They handed out a get to know you fact sheet, and on each sheet it had usual descriptive nonsense in it, but it also included our GPA and our GRE scores. Everyone wonders how I got through here so quick. It was like, wow, this is not good. You know, I need to go on fast track. You know, I don't need a life for 3 years. As long as I got a life at the end of 3, I'm okay. But this is going to take years off of my life to do this. And Sam also gave me a book that was called Academic Gamesmanship. And I doubt seriously any of you, it was written in 1970. Any of you who read the Rousseau book called Straight Man, about how screwed up colleges are and so forth, this was a strategic version of that. And each chapter was dedicated to how to survive as an undergraduate, how to survive as a graduate student, how to survive as an assistant professor, and it goes through all the ranks. And it basically was saying, you're screwed. You know, you just have to be careful when you're going through this, because there are so many mistakes you're going to make because you think you actually have clout when you don't have any clout at all, and all you can do is stay under the radar and be very selective about who you form alliances with and all the rest of that stuff. So I read that and said, this makes sense to me, and I think I can do that for 3 years. So I came in and immediately said to Jerry Miller and Brad Greenberg, who had published an article on source credibility that was very well received, and I said, I want to study message effects, and Brad looked at me and said, I don't do that. Oh. So I went to Jerry and said, I want to study message effects. I don't do that. So suddenly I realized I'd committed myself to a graduate program where no one did what I wanted to do. And, you know, one of my first lessons was the faculty won't develop interest to fit yours. So it was sort of like, cope, anxiety. And so I had to kind of figure out, how in the hell am I going to survive all of this now? Now, as Frank pointed out, it was a really heady time. There were a lot of good professors there and excellent graduate students, and so I could sort of commiserate with everybody about how they were going to get through this, and the Embers thing played a huge role. If it hadn't been for that, I probably would have floundered. But then I hit my last year, ready to get out, had dissertation data collected. I was on the 3-year plan, and the economy fell apart, went down. Universities thought that those males were going to continue to go to college after the Vietnam War ended. Suddenly you got a whole bunch of guys going, they can't draft me. And guess what I think about college? No. So universities were filled with empty dormitories. And the state legislatures responded by saying, what? Where's the tuition and all the rest of it? And they started cutting back, and very soon there were no jobs. Well, now there's about 12 to 15 of us out there who, many of us shared the same advisors. And we don't look a lot different from each other. And we're all on the job market. And so I'm sitting there going, how am I going to, I got married by that time, how are we going to survive? I went to talk to Brad Greenberg. I knew who had a grant. Said, Brad, what am I going to do? And he says, well, if you don't finish up, I'll find a way of funding you. But I got to tell you, don't finish your degree. If you finish your degree, I can't fund you. Well, that took the pressure off of finishing my dissertation. I immediately went, I got a plan. Well, it got turned upside down in a fortunate way, because Barnett Pierce, who was at the University of Kentucky, famous guy at the time, Barnett got in a fight with the University of Kentucky. Didn't get along. He got pissed at him. So he had a job offer from the University of Massachusetts, and he purposefully held off his resignation until after they could hire someone on a permanent line. It was sort of up yours. And so he did that. And fortunately for me, the guy was sitting there, and they suddenly had all these teaching lines they had to fill, and nobody in them. So Lou Donahue, who was on the faculty at Kentucky, called Brad Greenberg, because they both studied mass comm. He said, you got anybody? And Brad said, yeah, I got this guy named Mike Roloff. Bob Bostrom, who was on the faculty there, was a contemporary in graduate school of Jerry Miller. And so he calls him, he says, you got anyone? He says, yeah, I got this guy Mike Roloff. And all of a sudden I get a call from Kentucky saying, we got a line. It's only 1 year, but we got a line. I'm like, that's good. Does it pay? Yeah. Like, woo, and it's not here. So I was going to get out on time and take that first job. And so we packed it all in. I was never so, Greenberg and Miller had different styles and attitudes on a number of different things. They had similar streaks of getting things done. And I learned from both of them, and I found a way of integrating it. And both of them together really helped me in terms of getting out of there. For whatever frustration there was, getting them to coordinate was worth it in the end, at least from a self-interested perspective. So I go off to Kentucky, but I now got an interview for my own goddamn job, right? Any of you have ever had that experience? It's a 1-year contract, and you show up, and it's sort of like you look up, and suddenly there's your job being advertised, and they're saying, we're going to start bringing in applicants. So wait a minute, you just hired me. So I found Ed Barnicott, and so we started working together, because that was more functional than worrying about whether I had a job or not. And I started applying for jobs, and I got an interview at Northwestern. And so they brought in Mac Parks and myself, and they liked both of us. And they went to their dean and said, we want to hire 2 people. And the dean said, nope, 1 line, that's it. And so they chose Mac, and that was okay because Kentucky kept me. I had a job, and I had a job I liked. I learned to like Kentucky bourbon. I got into the Derby. I can do this. I can do this. I got a job. So Mac did exactly what he said he was going to do to Northwestern. He said, I'm coming to Northwestern, but I want to really live in Washington. And I only took this job because it was available. So the job opened up at Washington, and he leaves within a year. Well, suddenly the job opens up. I get another call from Northwestern. Hey, man, we interviewed you last year. We were really impressed. We'd like you to come back and interview again. So there I am, back at Northwestern again. I do the song and dance, and life repeats itself, just like serial arguments. So I come in, I do my song and dance. They say they like it. And suddenly I get a call from them saying, well, we're not going to hire you because we also interviewed Mary Ann Fitzpatrick. So they offer Mary Ann Fitzpatrick the job. I'm number 2, but that's okay because I got a job. And I like bourbon, and I like horses, and bluegrass isn't weird. And so I can do this. I can do this. And then all of a sudden, Mary Ann decides that Madison is where she wants to live. And so she says, I'm out of here. And I get another call from Northwestern. And they said, hey, man, we'd really like you. And I said, yeah. You can't fool me. I know this game. I've been through this game before. And they said, nah, man, this time it's for real. I said, I want to see it in writing. None of this chatter crap. I want to see it in writing. And so they sent it to me, and it was for real. And then I spent the next 44 years there as a result of all of that stuff. So the start was rocky. I mean, I gotta say, for about the first 5 years of my life, it was sort of constant work and stress, trying to figure out how in the hell do I get some sort of stability out of all of this stuff. But then I got to Northwestern, things started working out. There were a lot of good things that happened. First guy I worked with was Frank Tutzauer, and we did bargaining research and got a couple of things published that allowed me to get in contact with Bill Donahue. I cited his stuff, Linda Putnam. And so I started doing some negotiation research. I retained my interest in influence. Then I met Denise. Denise came in as a graduate student. And at that time, Chuck Berger was there. And Chuck was the magnet. My God, you know, my esteem had been beaten down enough with Fitzpatrick and Parks. I had absolutely no esteem left at all. So I didn't expect to see her ever show up at all. I was sort of there making do as best I could. And so we talked, and her father was a football coach, and my dad was a football coach, and so we had incidental, irrelevant similarity going from both of us. And we could sit there and talk, and all of a sudden she came in one day and said, I'd like you to be my advisor. And I said, what? And she said, yeah. And I said, oh, yeah. So then I said, what are you interested in? And so we started moving along those lines. But I also discovered that Northwestern has incredibly good undergraduates. It is truly a prestigious university. For all of its faults, their undergraduate programs are incredible. So I met Kenzie through Denise, and so we talked a lot about doing this, that, or the other, and so we developed a good relationship that continues to this day. I met, God, why am I blanking? See, that happens when you don't have notes. But I met a lot of different people along the way, undergraduates, and we were able to publish a lot of articles together on this stuff. And they were always open to what I was interested in, and I tried to stay interested in what they were doing, and it was mutually collaborative and beneficial. So the undergraduates kept me going for a while. But then what I discovered is after a while, as some of you know, the winds of change hit. And once upon a time when you fit, you don't fit no more. And I started learning new lessons about academia that if I'd just taken to heart academic gamesmanship, I would have probably remembered, meaning that it does matter who's in the upper administration of your college. And when they come in and declare what you're doing is dead, you sort of go, this is not good, right? And there is a thing, sometimes while tenure's a wonderful thing, it becomes like golden handcuffs. And you get comfortable where you are, because again, you can still do pretty much what you want. I always thought that the best way of dealing with me is to leave me alone. And as long as they leave me alone, and as long as I've got enough money to make ends meet, I can probably muddle my way through all of this. Angry most of the time. And that was a great thing about coming here. Some of you heard me come in and do my song and dance before a few years ago, where I got into a dark spiral of hostility. I remember it wasn't this room, it was another one. But I had great fun doing it. I got to watch Boster laugh. I got to watch all of you people. You were all so kind to laugh. I mean, as you can tell from this, my primary coping device is gallows humor. You know, you just have to laugh your way through it, because if you took it seriously, people might be in real trouble, right? If you really took it seriously, and you just have to find some element of humor in all of this stuff. I remember one of the things I quoted is they had told me, they sent a note to all the full professors that said, we've noted how many years you've got left. We want to know what you intend to do with those years. What new and innovative things are you going to do? And I basically wrote back and said, The same thing I've been doing my entire career. The dean didn't like that response. She somehow had it in her mind I should be doing something different, and I wasn't going to do anything different. And I remember looking at Boster, because he was sitting over on that side, and I said, they didn't understand. I'm from Michigan State. We are unleadable. No one can lead us. They really can't. They ought to just give up and let us go our own goddamn way. You know, just leave us alone. We'll be productive. You know, we'll do what we're supposed to, but we sure as hell are not going to go where you want us to go. So, you know, a lot of my life consisted of me going in whatever direction that I wanted to go, right? It was part of the culture of this place that you're unleadable. We are sort of an individualistic lot. I don't think that they give you an individualism scale when you apply here, but they seem to have some screening device for making sure they only hire people who are sort of individualistic when they look at this. And you just, what the hey, I'm going to do it my own way, damn it. So that was the sort of the story, but now the story ain't over for me. I just retired. Damn, you know, I made it to the finish line. And that has sort of changed life a little bit. I mean, I got to tell you, I'm kind of a believer in retirement. I know you're not supposed to say that. Oh, I miss the activities so damn much, you know. And I just spend nights regretting my decision. Oh, woe's me. Screw that. I have no trouble. The biggest problem is when you wake up in the morning and you sort of saying, oh, what do I want to do today? You know, when you spent, like I did, 13 years editing comm yearbook, or comm research, where you're living by filling issues and you got reviewers that are late, that's always there. And you're trying to figure out how to do it, to suddenly discover you got no deadlines except taxes. Those never go away. But, yeah, I know. So, I mean, you know, you kind of sit there and you go, I got freedom for the first time. God, I don't remember even having that as a kid. I still had to go to school. And this time I don't got to go to school. You know, I just walk the dog. And that's about it. And I could start watching television again. Hadn't watched television in a long damn time. You know, and I could start reverting back to my youth again. God, one of my grandchildren likes comic books. When I grew up, I was a comic book freak. And so I started buying comic books again and catching up on the old days. And, you know, I grew up in the late 1960s, the heydays of rock and roll and all kinds of music. And I started finding these sites where I could find bootlegs of recording things for the Beatles and stuff like that. And I started listening to all of these things that I had not listened to for a long time. Now, admittedly, I'm not through a year yet. It is altogether possible at some point I'll have listened to all the bad recordings of every Beatles song that has ever been created. I mean, I suddenly might take them at their word and say, we really released the best stuff we got, and the rest of it's shit. But I mean, you know, I intend to find out if the rest of it is still shit, or whether it was worth listening to all of that stuff. But I don't care, it's my time, right? If that's the way I want to spend it, that's the way I choose to spend it. I'm still trying to work out with my wife how to survive me being around. That's one of the things that I discovered as I go to my various doctors, and they ask about retirement, and I say, well, you know, we're still working on that. And I said, I don't know that my wife is quite accustomed to me not going to work yet. And all the doctors say the same thing. We hear a lot of that. You know, and I suddenly didn't feel bad. I thought it was just me. I was taking it personally. And they all said, yeah, you know, that all of a sudden you spend most of your marriage raising kids and doing other things, and suddenly you both are retired and you don't know what the hell to do. You're around. You should be going to work, right? You should be going to work. And suddenly serial arguments develop. And of course, you know, one underlying aspect of what I do, when I was early on at Northwestern, I had a colleague named Robin Lester who didn't stay very long, but she was there for a while. And she had a saying that said that academics only study what they're not good at. And that is basically our research agendas, for many of us anyway, is self-improvement. How can we learn to do what we think we really need to do? And as you can tell, for me, that consisted of trying to figure out how to influence other people. And I'm still doing that, I'm afraid, is I never really found the way of doing it. Although I must say that in connecting my research, it's sort of like, how do I avoid constant, ongoing serial arguments? And then manage to avoid them without undergoing all the costs that are associated with that. But anyway, thank you. And you all were much nicer to me than I anticipated that perhaps you were going to be. And you were right. I do have a dour outlook, but it's coping. As I said, gallows humor is everything for me. So, and I'm glad Esther was able to send her video thing, because she's near and dear too. Everybody, whatever I've accomplished is a joint activity. And so there are a lot of people that deserve credit, and I didn't get all of them mentioned, including many of you who are sitting here who may well have influenced me in ways you didn't even realize. So certainly did not do it alone. But anyway, thank you for being so polite and being here. I'm glad I did decide to attend. It was touch and go most of the way, but what the heck. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. I know we're slightly over time, but no one's ever going to stop Roloff from talking, so I wasn't about to try. But I know that we'll also be happy to hang out a bit if people have questions. I had promised there would be time for questions, but you also, as Frank warned me, you don't let communication people speak without a timer, and I thought I'd try. But I'm thrilled that you were here to hear just so much about Mike's work in communication, also just in personal relationships, in mentoring. And my wish for you is that you all have incredible colleagues, mentors, friends, as all of us up here have been incredibly fortunate to have over the years. So thank you all. I was supposed to at the beginning, and Denise alluded to it, and I completely forgot. But note, and Mike, after this, I'll tell you who actually posted it, but not now, that the new episode of Architects of Communication Scholarship, which is a podcast from ICA that is Mike being interviewed by Denise, was actually released today online in honor of his award tomorrow. So I'm not on Twitter, but it is. So, and Allison is, so she can help you out. I try to avoid that if at all possible, but I'm sure it is well worth the listen. So thank you so much for coming today. And as I said, we're happy to take questions. I had kind of promised that. So I'm gonna make them stay here if any of you have them, but also I recognize you all may have time and places that you need to be. So one more thanks to this amazing panel and to Mo and others for allowing us to let it happen. Thanks, Mike.
Are there questions?
Mike, did you get your dog back?
No, well, it was a combination. I had 2 dogs that were stolen. The first one, after my wife and I were living up here, we weren't married, so we bought a dog together and we named it, or we finally did get married, and we called it Legitimate. Legitimate disappeared from the backyard one day. And so some kids finally came over and said, your dog's lying dead about 2 weeks later. And so I found the dog and he'd been run over, and found out it was a neighborhood kid who had reached over the fence and stole it. So we replaced the dog, and we had the dog in the backyard, and we had 2 dogs, Duffy and Sparty. And Sparty was a small dog, and suddenly there was a banging on the back door, and it was a neighbor kid saying, somebody just stole your dog. And I knew nobody was gonna mess with Duffy. He was a big damn dog. but they'd grab legitimate, or Sparty rather, and they run a bicycle. So I ran out there, and one of the neighborhood kids said, "Borrow my bike, you can chase the kid." So there I am. Back in those days, they were those little Stingray bicycles, that you went nowhere, and they had big handlebars. So there I am, coming down the street on this thing with a flurry of kids with other Stingways around me going, "He's going that way!" And so we're driving down the street chasing this kid, and I can see he's got the dog under his arm, so that emboldens me further. And so he goes across 3 lanes of traffic and doesn't get hit, but goes across, and I, at that point, had good sense not to follow him that way. But one of the kids said, "We know where he lives." So we went over and we took a shortcut and we pulled in front, and I was sitting in front, looked in the backyard, and here came this kid walking in his backyard with my dog. And so I must admit, I'm not a particularly violent person, but I had images of what I wanted to do to this kid who had stolen my dog. So I ran down there to confront him, and the kid did the wisest thing he could do. He handed me the dog. So I had a dog in my arms, and I just took the dog and said, "I'm out of here." And so we got in the front yard, and one of the kids had gone to get the police. And so the kid had stolen it, was in his house. And I said, "The kid took my dog," and the cop said, "Well, we don't have any evidence of that, even though all the kids said you did, and you said that but he wasn't gonna do anything." So later I discovered the moral of the story was that I lived in an area of Lansing that was made up of unemployed Oldsmobile workers. And the one kid who stole was part of the Oldsmobile plant. And so they weren't gonna turn him in. They knew he had the dog, but they weren't gonna turn him in. The other kid was an outsider. He lived in a different neighborhood, and he was Hispanic. And so they were more than willing to turn him in. And so I chased him down. So I learned multiple lessons out of the theft of the dogs. My dog story is something that I told for a long time. It's got lots of dimensions to it. That stealing your dog when you've had it is like someone, not quite as bad as stealing your child, but damn it, it really pisses you off when somebody steals your dog, man. But then suddenly discovering the way that bias is built into the system and what people are willing to report and not willing to report. And sometimes aggression, as much as you'd really like to do, it's not the best alternative. Take your dog and get the hell out of it. So that's a long answer to your story.
It's, I've heard the story. Frank loves to tell it.
And actually, we can ask more questions, but I've been told that actually, since we were supposed to be out of here at 4, we really need to be out of here at now. So we can adjourn to the lobby, and we're happy to continue to chat
I'll talk
as
to you
well.
a little bit. I've got to be somewhere at 6 o'clock.
Yes,
So I've got
so-
to go back and
Right, so we
gussy
are,
up.
yes, there are some limits, but thank you so much. Thanks to